This is part B of chapter 6, which deals with the bones and skeletal tissue. We are continuing on. We're going to look at how the bone is developed. Ossification, also known as osteogenesis, is that process of forming new bone tissue. When does this occur? Well, it begins at about month 2 after conception. Remember, initially everything is cartilage. And then after birth, postnatally, the bone growth is going to continue until you reach early adulthood. Now, what we call bone remodeling and repair is response to different stresses that you're undergoing. That occurs throughout the rest of your life. So we kind of distinguish between these various forms. Is it formation or is it remodeling? So up to about week 8 after conception, the fibrous membranes and the hyaline cartilage in that fetal skeleton, they have been cartilage, they're going to start to be replaced with bone tissue. And there's 2 different types of ossification processes, endochondral and intramembranous. Endochondral ossification, this is where the bone forms by replacing that hyaline cartilage. Most of the skeleton is going to be formed in this manner. Intramembranous ossification is when the bone develops from the fibrous membranes. Endochondral ossification, this forms most of the bones basically inferior to the skull except for the clavicles. As I said earlier, it begins late in month 2 of development. It requires the hyaline cartilage to be broken down prior to the ossification. So it's going to start at what's known as your primary ossification center. That's going to be located in the center of the shaft, what is eventually going to become your diaphysis. Blood vessels are going to start to infiltrate into that perichondrium, and they're going to convert it to the periosteum. So think perichondrium, chondrocytes, etc. refer to cartilage. Osteum refers to bone. So the blood vessels infiltrate the perichondrium, which is cartilage, and they're going to convert it to the periosteum, which you know is that outer membrane that's going to be lining the superficial surface of the bone. Mesenchymal cells, which are a type of embryonic cells, they're going to specialize into osteoblasts. And you already know that the osteoblasts are bone-forming cells. So there's 5 main steps that occur during this process. Number 1, you're going to form what's known as the bone collar, and that's going to form around the diaphysis of that cartilage. The central cartilage in the diaphysis is going to start to calcify, and then it starts to develop into cavities. The periosteal bud invades the cavities, and it leads to the formation then of the spongy bone that you see internally. This bud is made up of blood vessels, it's made up of nerves, osteogenic cells, osteoclasts, and red marrow. And then step 4 is that diaphysis is going to start to elongate, and you're going to form the medullary cavity. A secondary ossification center is going to start to appear in the epiphyse, remember, on the ends. The epiphyse will then ossify. Cartilage, that hyaline cartilage, remains only in the epiphyseal plates and then also on the articular cartilage. Remember, that's on the end. So, as we see over here, you form this bone collar around the diaphysis. So the blue is all the hyaline cartilage, and then this tan is where you start to form the bone collar. That's your primary ossification center. See how it's elongating. You're starting to form this cavity in here, which is going to become the medullary cavity. You've got your blood vessels, etc., invading. You continue the elongation. You continue the ossification around the collar. Now you've got your secondary ossification on the epiphyse that is formed. And then as you continue on, excuse me, at birth, this is what it's going to be like. And then through adolescence, This epiphyseal plate, the cartilage here, continues, so you are growing towards either end to elongate the bone until you reach adulthood. And then the articular cartilage on the end is the other place where you have remnants of the hyaline cartilage. Intramembranous ossification begins with the fibrous connective tissue membranes that have been formed by the mesenchymal cells. This will form your frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and clavicle bones. There's 4 major steps that are involved here. You have the ossification centers. They are formed when you have those mesenchymal cells again. They tend to come together in clusters, and then they become osteoblast. The osteoid is secreted. Remember, that's that matrix that the osteoblasts secrete, and then it becomes calcified. The bone is formed when the osteoid is laid down with blood vessels. You end up forming those trabeculi. Excuse me. And then laminar bone replaces the woven bone, and the red marrow appears in there. So here you have this cluster forming, and then internally you have your osteocytes, your osteoblast along the external portion. This light tan here is your bone matrix that's been newly formed. You have your blood vessels coming in, forming the woven bone, which then becomes the spongy bone, and your marrow forms in here. In terms of postnatal bone growth, the long bones are going to grow lengthwise by what we call interstitial growth at that epiphyseal plate. Bones will increase in thickness and diameter through oppositional growth. Now, bones will stop growing during adolescence. Some facial bones will continue to grow very slowly throughout life, and then they will grow in response to various stresses. The interstitial growth, you must have cartilage at the epiphyseal plate. That epiphyseal plate maintains a constant thickness because you're replacing cartilage with bone on one side, but you keep making more cartilage on the other side. So it just kind of consistently moves. Your epiphyseal plate can be divided into 5 zones. You have a resting or quiescent zone, proliferation or growth zone, hypertrophic zone, calcification zone, and then ossification or osteogenic zone. So the resting zone, that is the area of the cartilage on the epiphyseal side of the plate, and it's relatively inactive. It's helping to hold the cartilage to the epiphyseal side of the bone. The proliferation or growth zone, this is area of cartilage on the diaphyseal side that's very actively going through mitosis, as the name would imply. And it's forming new cells, and it's pushing it upward. So it's pushing that epiphyse away from the diaphyse. It's causing the lengthening of the bone. The hypertrophic zone, this is an area where you have older chondrocytes. They tend to, the cartilage, the lacunae that's holding the chondrocytes in them tend to enlarge. There's some larger interconnecting spaces there. The calcification zone, this is where the cartilage matrix starts to calcify. Chondrocytes are dying, they're deteriorating. And then the ossification zone, this is where you basically are having areas that get broken down by osteoclast, and the new bone is laid by osteoblast. Ultimately, you have spongy bone that is replacing this area. The medullary cavity is going to enlarge as those little spikes are eroded. So if you look at it from this viewpoint, over here, just to point of reference for you, here's the diaphyse. On the end, remember, it's the epiphyse. So it's like we're taking a little section right here, and here's your epiphyseal plate. So up here is the epiphyse. So here's your resting zone up here. The this is connecting, helping to connect to that epiphyse here. So now right here is where we are in the epiphyseal plate. Proliferation zone. This is where those cartilage cells are undergoing through mitosis. And then the hypertrophic is where, see how they're enlarged? They're much larger than the cells over here. Calcification zone, that matrix now starts to calcify, the cartilage cells are dying. Now the matrix starts to deteriorate, blood vessels are moving in, and then the ossification zone is where you're forming those new bones. You've got the osteoblast that's laying down the matrix. So this is new bone here. But this entire epiphyseal plate as a unit is moving upwards. So as you start to reach adolescence, those chondroblasts start to divide less often. And the epiphyseal plate, it tends to thin that distance, and it's replaced by bone. Now you still see it when it closes, when the epiphyse and diaphyse fuse. On an X-ray, it's very thin, but it's the epiphyseal line. So when you use the term epiphyseal line, it just means that, yes, that growth has stopped. When does this occur? Females, typically by 18. Males, about 21. Now, what about growth and thickness and width or diameter? Well, as they're lengthening, they also have to grow in width. Now, this can occur throughout life. The bones are going to respond to different stresses that are placed on them. What am I talking about, different stresses? Well, maybe from muscle activity or added weight. The body is going to respond to that. If you've been relatively inactive during the COVID-19 pandemic as compared to what you were prior, the bone responds to that. Now, if you've been very disciplined, like some of us maybe have not, and you have increased your activity, once again, the bones are going to respond to that. So they respond to increased muscle activity, they respond to increased weight or decreased weight too. Osteoblasts beneath the periosteum, they're going to start to secrete more bone matrix on the external surface of the bone, not internally, but external. The osteoclasts, remember, they're removing bone matrix, and they're going to do that on the endosteal surface, so on the interior portion. So you're building up faster than you're breaking down. If you build up faster than you're breaking down, you usually end up with thicker, stronger bone. But you don't want it to be too heavy, which is why the osteoclast must be breaking down internally. So this is just showing once again on the epiphyse how you're replacing bone here. And you can do remodeling depending on where the stress is coming from. If you have a lot of stress coming here on the left side, you're going to want to build up bone thicker over here. So what regulates or what controls the bone growth? A lot of it's hormonal. You have the growth hormone. This is going to be the most important hormone during infancy and childhood that stimulates the bone growth at that epiphyseal plate. The thyroid hormone is going to help control the activity of the growth hormone, trying to make sure that you have enough but not too much. When you study the endocrine system, which is studying the hormones, you will find that oftentimes it's kind of like a cascade or a stepwise event, that you produce one hormone that triggers the release of a second hormone or regulates it, and then that does its job. So the growth hormone is going to be basically the stimulus for the bone growth, but the thyroid hormone helps to regulate the growth hormone. Like I said, not too much, but enough to have the growth. Now, testosterone in males and estrogen in females, that tends to, at puberty, you see an increase in those hormones being produced. That also will stimulate growth, and that's why you tend to have these growth spurts at puberty. If you have an excess of any of these hormones or not enough, so a deficit of it, you can end up with abnormal skeletal growth, either too much or too little. Now, a lot of the bone mass gets recycled, like I said, depending upon the environmental stresses that are being placed on them. Spongy bones replaced about every 3 to 4 years, compact bone about every 10 years. So bone remodeling is this balance between depositing more bone matrix and reabsorbing some of it. So it's this balance between the osteoblast and the osteoclast. It's occurring where? The periosteum and the endostom. So on the external surface as well as the endostom, which is, remember, lining the medullary cavity. So you have to have this balance between the osteoblast and the osteoclast. And who's helping to control that? Your osteocytes. So remember, your new bone matrix is deposited by the osteoblast. The osteoid seam, this is this band of unmineralized bone matrix that marks that new area, because initially it's the matrix, it's secreted by the osteoblast, but it doesn't become mineralized or hardened for about 48 hours. Calcification front, this is this transition zone between the newly formed matrix and the older mineralized bone. Now, we don't know exactly what some of the triggers for the deposit may be. Part of it is mechanical, part of it is if you have increased concentrations of things like calcium and phosphate, which help to form that bone matrix. Resorption is, as said, due to the osteoclast. You tend to get these grooves or depressions as they're breaking down the matrix. They tend to secrete lysosomal enzymes, which are these highly digestive enzymes, and protons that are breaking down the matrix. Acidity helps to convert the calcium salts to a soluble form so that they can then be carried off into the bloodstream. Osteoclasts are also going to phagocytize, meaning they're going to take up some of the demineralized matrix as well as some of the dead osteocytes. And then all cells are really good at recycling, so they'll reuse some of those products. They will release some of this then into the interstitial fluid, that fluid that's between cells, and like I say, eventually it ends up in the blood. Osteoclast activation usually involves the parathyroid hormone and also some of your immune T cell proteins. So some remodeling is occurring continuously, but a lot of it is controlled by genetic factors and what we call control loops, hormonal controls. One of those big hormonal controls, and I've mentioned this briefly before in previous PowerPoints in the Chapter 6, Part 1. With the hormonal controls, one thing is a negative feedback loop that involves calcium levels. Calcium is going to be monitored in the blood, so the concentration of it needs to be within a certain range. It's all part of the homeostatic balances. So why is it monitoring calcium? Well, calcium is extremely important. You need to have calcium in order to send nerve impulses. You need to have calcium in order for muscle contractions to occur. You need to have calcium in order to have blood clotting, for secretions of from certain glands. You need to have calcium for cell division. So calcium is very, very important for so many different functions. And so where is most of the excess calcium stored? It's going to be stored in the bone matrix. But where calcium is monitored as to how much you have, the concentration of it, it's going to be monitored in the blood. Another very important thing with calcium is that to keep in mind, in order to absorb calcium, you can have a whole bunch of calcium in your diet, but in order to absorb it in the intestines, you need to have vitamin D. If you do not have vitamin D, you're not going to absorb that calcium. So just FYI, that's why a lot of your dairy products that tend to have calcium in them also have vitamin D with them as well. And then, as I've said a bit ago, the remodeling, part of this bone remodeling is going to be in response to any type of mechanical stresses. So if we look a little bit more detail at the hormonal controls, parathyroid hormone, known as PTH, as the name implies, it's produced by your parathyroid glands. It is going to be produced in response to low blood calcium levels. You need to get the calcium levels up. How are you going to do that? Well, the parathyroid hormone stimulates the osteoclast, which makes sense, right? Because the osteoclast, what's it going to do? It's going to break down the bone matrix. And what's in the bone matrix? It's mostly composed of calcium. So what happens to that calcium as it's released from the bone? It goes into the blood, which then raises the level of calcium in the blood. Now, the hormone secretion is going to stop once you've increased those calcium levels in the blood back up to normal levels. It's kind of like, okay, we got it back up, folks. We don't need any more calcium. We are good to go. Calcitonin is produced by specific cells known as parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland. Now, calcitonin is produced and then secreted in the opposite situation. It's going to be secreted when levels of calcium in the blood are too high. And so what do you need to do? You need to decrease that level of calcium. You can lower the levels of calcium, basically store it in the bone now, because you have it too high in the blood until you get it to lower levels. So this diagram is just showing what I was just saying, that ideally you want to keep the concentration of calcium around 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 mils in the blood. So if calcium levels fall below that, what happens? That stimulus triggers the parathyroid glands to secrete parathyroid hormone, which in turn is going to stimulate the osteoclast to break down the bone matrix. What does that do? It releases calcium back into the blood, restoring it back to this homeostatic level. From some clinical standpoints, so some examples, very small changes in blood calcium levels can cause some very severe problems. I say it's involved with neuron stimulation, muscle contraction, etc. Hypocalcemia, meaning low levels of calcium, they can cause hyperexcitability. Hypercalcium, which is high levels of calcium, can cause non-responsiveness. So if you have high levels of blood calcium sustained over long periods of time, it can lead to deposits of calcium salts in the blood vessels or in the kidneys, and then that forms kidney stones, which is extremely painful. So ideally, just avoid all of that and maintain calcium levels at that normal homeostatic range. There are some additional hormones that can play a role in the bone density and how the bone remodels. Just some parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are the two major ones, but these are some other ones. Leptin, which is released by adipose tissue, tends to inhibit osteoblasts, so that will keep calcium levels higher in the blood. Serotonin, which most of you may be familiar with that more as a neurotransmitter, helping to regulate mood, helping to regulate sleep, but it can also interfere with the osteoblast activity. Most of the serotonin is made in basically your intestines, secreted into the blood after a meal. In terms of response to mechanical stresses, bones reflect the stresses so that they are encountered, that's placed on them. And the muscles, the pull that's being placed on whenever the muscles contract. Most of the stress is kind of off-centered, and so the bones tend to bend slightly. The Wolff's Law just states that bones are going to grow or remodel in response to the demands that are placed on them. So usually, because it's a little off-center and bones tend to bend a little bit, you tend to have compression on one side and stretching on another. So you can look at the diaphysis. It's going to be thickest where the bending stresses are the greatest. So that's what I'm saying. You can look at the bone and you can, from the structure of it, structure determines function, you can look at the structure and determine where most of the stress has been. So you've got right here tension and then compression going on here. Wolff's Law, because of us responding to where the stress is, it explains what we call handedness, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. You tend to have thicker and stronger bones on that corresponding upper limb. So if you're right-handed, your bones on the right arm typically are thicker and stronger than on the left side. Curved bones are thickest, most likely where they could buckle. Tuberculi form these trusses along the stress lines. Large bony projections occur where you've got very heavy and active muscles attaching to them so they can deal with that extra stress. Bones of fetus and bedridden people tend to lack a lot of these bone markings, as we said earlier. Why? Because there's not stress on the bones. So how does this occur? Well, the mechanical stress produces electrical signals when the bone's deformed, and there is a response to that. Hormonal controls will determine if and where the remodeling occurs in response to changing blood calcium levels, but the mechanical stress determines where it's going to occur. So what happens when you do end up having a broken bone? How is the bone going to repair? Well, fractures or breaks. In youth, most fractures are resulting from trauma. Oftentimes because in our youth, a lot of times people think they can do a lot more than what they're supposed to, and they have no fear. In old age, usually fractures occur because the bones are thinning and it's a weakness. We can classify fractures by several different ways. By the position of the long bones after the fracture. Non-displaced means that the bone's broken but they've remained in their normal position. Displaced means the ends are out of their normal alignment and you need to realign them properly for the best healing process. They can be classified according to the completeness of the break. A complete break is where it's broken all the way through. Incomplete is where it has not broken all the way through. And then you can also classify them as to whether or not the skin was broken, whether the bone penetrated out through the skin. An open or compound fracture is when the skin has been penetrated. A closed or simple fracture is when the skin is not penetrated or broken. You can also describe them by the location, the nature of the break, etc. And so these next few slides are giving some examples of some of your more common fractures. When you have a break and the bone breaks into 3 or more pieces, It's a comminuted break. It's more common in older people where the bone is more brittle. A compression fracture is when the bone has been crushed. Oftentimes this is with extreme trauma, like a fall. A spiral, as you can see here, it's due to twisting forces. This is fairly common in sports, say where you're running and turning at the same time. So it's not a nice clean break across. It's, as you can see this on the x-ray here. Epiphyseal is where it occurs right along the epiphyseal plate. A depressed is where the broken bone portion is pressed inward. Oftentimes this happens on a skull fracture. Green stick is where the break has occurred, but the entire bone is not broken. It's an incomplete break. So on one side it's broken, the other side tends to bend. That's more common in children than in adults because the bones tend to be a little more flexible in children than in adults. So what type of treatment do you need to do when there's been a fracture? It involves what we call reduction. You have to realign the broken ends. Sometimes they are properly aligned. Sometimes the physician may have to kind of manipulate it. A closed reduction is where the physician manipulates the bones into the correct position. An open reduction is when you might have to add pins or wires to help to hold it and secure it in place. And then you need to immobilize that bone. You need to put it in a cast. You need to put it possibly in a traction depending on which bone. Immobilize it so the healing can take place. It's going to take time. Okay, how long will it take? Number one, you need to immobilize and not be using that bone to allow the repair. How long it takes will depend on the severity of the break. It depends on which bone is broken. And also depends on the age. Everything slows down as we age. There's 4 main steps for repair: hematoma formation, fibrocartilaginous callus formation, bony callus formation, and finally bone remodeling. The hematoma formation, this occurs right away. The torn blood vessels are hemorrhaging, they're bleeding, and they start to form this clotted blood. It's called a hematoma, a mass around where that break has occurred. You have torn blood vessels, so it's going to bleed. You have torn, remember, bones have very good supply of blood and nerves, and so it's going to hurt. You have, because of the breaking, the injury, the body has detected that. You're going to want to have immediately start clotting the blood to stop the blood flow. That means you're increasing fluid to that site. Your body knows there's injured tissue here. You have to send in macrophages to clean up all the injured and potentially invasive organisms. You don't want to have infection. So the area is going to be swollen. And that's pressing on additional nerves besides the ones that were injured. So it's going to be painful. It's going to be inflamed. The inflammatory response is the initial part of that is a protective thing. You had a break here. You don't want to have possibly any invaders, any microorganisms, to be able to penetrate and then infect further up. So that's why you have the inflammatory response. It's trying to contain everything here. I say you're going to form this hematoma, form this blood clot around here. Stop the bleeding, stop the possibility of penetration of any microorganisms, and start cleanup repair. The fibrocartilaginous callus formation, you've got capillaries that are growing into the hematoma area. Phagocytic cells are cleaning all that injured, damaged tissue and cells. They're a cleanup crew. Fibroblasts are starting to secrete collagen fibers to connect the broken ends together. You're starting to repair. So fibroblasts, cartilage, and osteogenic cells, they're starting that whole reconstruction. There's going to create cartilage matrix to repair that tissue. Osteoblasts are going to come in and start forming the spongy bone within that matrix. So you're forming this fibrocartilaginous callus at this point. You have an internal callus and then the external callus. Their names are by the location. And then the bony callus, within 1 week, the new trabeculi are appearing in the fibrocartilaginous callus. The callus is converted to bone, so it's becoming hard. It's mostly spongy bone that's going to be forming. That's going to continue for about 2 months until you get a nice connection between the two, where the break is between the two ends of the break. So here you're forming that bony callus. And then finally, bone remodeling. This starts during the bony callus formation. It will continue for several months. Excess material on the diaphyseal exterior and within the medullary cavity, that's going to be removed by some of those phagocytic cells. Compact bone is going to be laid down. It's reconstructing the diaphyseal walls there. By the time it is done, it ideally will resemble the original structure. It's going to be responding to the same stressors that you had before. Like I say, this just average in terms of time, that eventually the bone remodeling occurs and hopefully you're back to the way you were prior to the injury. Age plays a huge role in how quickly or how slowly this occurs. There are several different bone diseases and disorders. We'll just look at a few of them. Bone disorders here, if we look at imbalances between how much bone is being deposited as a matrix versus how much of it's being resorbed. What's that balance between the osteoblast and the osteoclast? So when you end up with an imbalance, that's when you tend to have different types of disorders. There's 3 major bone diseases that are discussed here: Osteomalacia and Rickets, Osteoporosis, and Paget's disease. Osteomalacia is where the bones are very poorly mineralized. You form the osteoid, but the calcium salts are not adequately deposited, so they never harden. What does that result in? Very soft and weak bones, which have problems bearing weight. It's very painful for the person to put any weight then on the bones. Rickets, this is osteomalacia in children. You result in having bowed out legs, other bone deformities, because what happens is the long bones tend to be abnormally long. What's the cause of this? Vitamin D deficiency. Can also be due to insufficient dietary calcium. You are not putting that calcium salts in the matrix, either because you don't have enough calcium, or like I said earlier, you could have enough calcium but you don't have enough vitamin D. And so you must have that vitamin D in order to absorb the calcium. Osteoporosis. There's a whole group of diseases that fall under this. Basically, what happens is the bone is being broken down faster than you're depositing the matrix. And ultimately what happens is, so your bone mass is declining. Where the areas where you see this most commonly is in the spongy bone of the spine and the neck of the femur are most susceptible, which then means both vertebral and hip fractures are most common in these individuals. So this is, on the upper picture here is showing normal spongy bone. And then on the bottom here is bone from someone who is suffering from osteoporosis, where that bone mass is declining. So you're reabsorbing, you're removing more of the matrix than what you're laying down. That makes for much weaker bones, increasing the risk of fractures. What are some of the risk factors for osteoporosis? Most often you look at the age and you say postmenopausal women. This will end up affecting about 30% of women age 60 to 70 years old and about 70% of women by age of 80. About 30% of Caucasian women will fracture a bone because of osteoporosis. Why does it affect women more than men? Because estrogen plays a role in bone density. So what happens with women is when they reach menopause, the level of estrogen being produced decreases. And so then that puts women now at higher risk. Men are protected because of testosterone helps to protect the effects of this. Some additional risk factors: if you're very petite, if you're not exercising enough to put that extra stress on the bones, if you have a diet poor in protein and calcium, smoking puts you at a higher risk. If there are certain hormone-related conditions such as hyperthyroidism, low levels of thyroid-stimulating hormone, diabetes, if you're, once again, immobile, that's not putting stress on the bones. Males who have prostate cancer and are taking androgen-suppressing drugs, that will put them at higher risk. So know if you're at a higher risk and what are some of the treatment options. Some of the traditional treatments is to increase calcium levels. Also increase vitamin or take vitamin D supplements to help increase the calcium absorption. Start doing weight-bearing exercises. Hormone replacement therapy, it will slow the bone loss, it does not reverse it. Now, hormone replacement therapy, there are pros and cons with this. For a while, they used to really advocate for this to help prevent osteoporosis. Now there's some controversy. You have to look at that on an individual basis with your patient, or you're considering it, because hormone replacement therapy has also been associated with an increased risk of heart attack, increased stroke risk, and increased breast cancer risk. So that's where you have to balance the pros and cons. In that, it has to be decided on an individual basis because everyone has different risk factors, different situations. So that has to be looked at on an individual basis, but just know that there's pros and cons of it. Paget's disease is what happens is you have excess bone deposit, but it's done in a very haphazard, random way, and reabsorption causes basically the bone to be very haphazardly broken down. The resulting thing is that the bone is made very fast and it's made very poorly. You end up with a very high ratio of spongy bone to compact bone, and there's reduced mineralization. Usually this occurs in the spine, the pelvis, the femur, and the skull. It usually occurs later in life. Rarely do you see it before age 40. We don't know exactly what the cause is. It has been suspected it may be caused by a virus, but we don't know. Some of the treatments includes taking calcitonin and biphosphates. But it's just something to be aware of. These are just some of the diseases and disorders associated with bones in the skeletal system.